Raise your hand. Who of you uses open source projects? Not yet. Awesome. That's literally everyone in the room, I think. So raise your hand again. Who of you submitted issues or pull requests to other people's open source projects? That's also almost everyone. Really cool. And finally, who of you runs their own open source project? It's like 25% maybe. Really cool. Thank you. So almost everyone in this room interacts with open source projects in some way. And I'm an iOS developer myself, and we use a lot of open source projects when building iOS apps nowadays. So out of curiosity, who of you works on mobile applications, iOS or Android? That's also a big chunk, maybe half the audience. And who of you works on iOS apps? Raise your hand again. Like maybe 20%? Cool. So I'm Felix Krause. I'm the creator of Fastlane, a very popular open source project for iOS and Android app developers. So just a quick introduction. Fastlane is a tool that allows you to automate the deployment to the App Store. So while for backend developers, it's obvious that when you push changes to Git, the changes are live basically immediately, that's not the case on mobile, especially not on iOS. Another thing is, on iOS, you have to take care of localized screenshots, take care of code signing, and so on. So Fastlane automates all of these things. But today, I don't want to talk about Fastlane. I want to talk about open source communities. So this talk is going to be only about 20 minutes, so we're going to have enough time to answer some questions afterwards. So feel free to use the app to submit some questions we can answer afterwards. I was lucky enough to start this small side project, Fastlane, and grow it into a tool that is now part of Google with over 13,000 commits and 15,000 stars on GitHub. Fastlane is actively being developed by over 600 external contributors. Some of them are here in the audience. That's really cool. And it was recently named as one of the most active open source projects on GitHub. I started this project around 2.5 years ago. Only a few months after that, lots of companies reached out, including Twitter and so on. I joined Twitter to work on Fastlane full-time, and just a few months ago, I joined Google together and joined Google a few months ago, and now I work on Fastlane full-time at Google. So in this talk, I want to share a little bit about what I learned when scaling these projects from 0 to tens of thousands of active users. In general, when you start open source projects, you can categorize them into 4 different stages. The first one is when you just put out some source code somewhere, like you put some code on GitHub or Bitbucket, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the code is used anywhere yet, right? You just put it out there. And almost half the projects on GitHub have no activity at all, like no stars, no issues, no pull requests. When it gets interesting is when you get into stage 2, which is when developers start using your project. And this is a really cool feeling. Someone, somewhere in the internet, a random person, took the time to read through your description and decided, well, that's cool, I'm going to start using this. And you might realize that when people start submitting issues or pull requests, that's usually when you see, oh, wait, this is getting traction. Number 3 is when your project becomes the go-to solution in its field. So this is also a really fascinating stage. You realize that when people start blogging about it, when people start tweeting about it, and when other people start talking at conferences about your product. And stage 4, not as cool, hyperscale projects. That's when you get up in the morning with 200 new GitHub notifications. That's when there is blog posts that attack your projects. That's when there is tweets that say, oh, your project is stupid. So sometimes projects start directly in stage 4. So for example, React Native by Facebook was built internally and then published. So it immediately had like 10,000 stars. So I was lucky enough to go through all these stages and didn't do the Kickstart version. And I learned a lot over the last 2 years, but not so much about design patterns or software engineering itself, but more about the human factor of open source. So how to interact with your community members, how to help other people, how to enable contributors to have the highest impact and to help each other. So first I want to quickly cover some of the challenges you will face as your project grows, and then I will talk about some of the solutions you can apply to your own open source projects. Let's start with the project momentum. The bigger your project becomes, the harder it is to keep the innovation and the speed you had in the beginning. Because suddenly, you have to account and think about hundreds of different use cases and thousands of production setups. So you cannot just change a default value, or you cannot just remove an option. People will be really mad if you do that. And a big part of all of this is also handling support. Because once you have a few thousand active users of your software, you will realize that helping users takes more time than actually spending time in your text editor. So this graph shows that I spent twice as much time on GitHub than I did in my text editor. And people submit all kinds of issues. It's not just issues, but it's a lot of feature requests or just ideas. So you have to decide how you want to receive feature requests and how you want to handle them. You could say, oh, just submit an issue. I'm going to label them, and then we can discuss it there. You can have a separate website where people can submit ideas and then upvote them and comment on them. And finally, you can even feature freeze your project and say you don't accept any new features at all. And all features have to align with your project vision, with the idea of why you created the project in the first place. So you as a project owner and project maintainer have to have a way to close an issue or pull request if you don't agree with it. And this is really important. With Fastlane, very often this happened. We would get an issue that says, well, every morning I get up and I'm so tired already. And then I have to make the coffee myself. Like, it would be really cool if Fastlane did that for me. And this is, of course, not a real example, but it was kind of similar. And I would go ahead and would say, that's not something that fits into our product vision. We cannot accept this feature. Can you guess what happened the next day? Well, I woke up this morning, and my coffee wasn't there. Why did you close the issue? So this happens a lot with open source projects. So again, you have to have a way to close an issue if you don't agree with them. And very similarly to issues, you have to decide what pull requests to merge and which to reject. Because once a change is merged into your code base, you are the one who is responsible for testing and supporting this feature for all future releases. And very often, if that feature breaks in the future, you will be the one who has to fix it. And in general, reviewing and testing pull requests takes almost as much time as writing the code for it. So that's something a lot of people don't consider. And this is a phenomenon you can see with many open source projects, including Fastlane. A project was started because the creator needed it for themselves. And suddenly they work full-time on this project, and with that stopped being a user of their own software. So you have to actively work to fix this. For example, Fastlane is deployed using Fastlane. Therefore, everybody working on the code base is also using the product. But this is not always possible. And if that's the case, you have to make sure to properly go through the complete onboarding steps from time to time. You have to make sure to read through the documentation and make sure everything is solid. And there is a big information imbalance between the project maintainers and its users. So for you as a maintainer, an issue is just another issue that has to be prioritized. But for the user, this issue is everything. And it might keep them from using your product. So this hit me the first time I attended the Apple Developer Conference in San Francisco, and people came up to me and just asked something about this one specific feature, about this one specific issue they had, and they assumed that I would know all the context around it to actually discuss it with them. So for you as a maintainer, it's an issue that has to be prioritized, and it might not be the most important thing for you right now. But for the user, this one issue is everything, and might actually keep them from using your product. So now to the more interesting part of the presentation, about how you can actually grow your open source project the healthy way. And we've tried many different approaches. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, and I'm going to cover some of the approaches that worked. So first off, improve your error messages. No matter how good your software actually is, you will always run into some unexpected errors. So the way you show them is actually really, really important. So this is how we showed error messages in Fastlane in the past. So Fastlane is a command line tool. I forgot to mention that. So when Fastlane had an error, we would print out all of this, like the stack trace and the environment, like the configuration and so on. And this, of course, was very confusing for the user. So we just simplified it and showed the most important information while still having a way to get the other information as well. So we even do some more things, like we link to Stack Overflow replies in error messages. We will show you commands that you can run to reproduce the issue. And we show extra information, like any identification or names you might need to debug an issue. And once you have great error messages, you have to make it as easy as possible for users to find similar issues. So when you receive a cryptic error message, what is the first thing you do? You would usually go ahead and Google the error message, or you would search on GitHub. So you should make it as easy as possible for the user to do so. Ideally, it happens right when the error happens. So if Fastlane crashes, we will now show similar GitHub issues right in the user's terminal, which allows the user to just click on the link and read how other people fix that issue. Maybe there's already a workaround they can use. And if people don't find existing discussion, chances are high they're going to submit a new issue. So the way you manage GitHub issues is very, very important. And I'm not a big fan of bots and automated messages. But as soon as you reach a certain scale, you need them to be able to prioritize and actually work through issues. In this section, I want to show you some of the most important bots you can set up for your open source projects. All these bot features are all open source under the MIT license and are actively used for the Fastlane repo. Providing all information when submitting an issue is actually a bug report is really hard, and even for us as software engineer. So GitHub recently introduced the issuetemplate.md file that would autofill the new issue form with a given string. However, most of you might know is that people would just remove it and replace it with their own question. So very often with Fastlane, we would get an error message like this. It would just have a very brief description of what the error is, and it doesn't contain any information like the Fastlane version, which we actually need. So using the Fastlane bot, we can ensure that all information is available, and if not, we can tell the user how to provide the extra information. And you should make it as easy as possible for the user to do so. That's why we started the Fastlane env command, which would basically, the user runs that locally, and it will collect all the system information we need, like the Ruby version, the Fastlane plugins that are being used, the OpenSSL version, and it would generate this really nice looking markdown text that people can just paste on GitHub. And if you receive similar error messages, similar issues very often, you should always step back and fix the underlying issue. However, or sometimes maybe it's just a documentation update you need to do. However, sometimes that's just not possible. So for iOS, for example, code signing is really hard. Like there's a lot of problems related to code signing. So we wrote this very extensive guide for people that would describe how to set up code signing and how to troubleshoot issues. But it turns out developers don't like reading a documentation. So unless you point them to the right spot, which is what the Fastlane bot does here. And this is basically just a very easy keyword-based reply system. And the key to handle large support for large-scale open source projects is to keep issues moving. You have to avoid having issues stall. So all of the iOS developers in this audience know how frustrating it can be if you submit a radar, which is the Apple bug report system, and you don't hear back for like 2 years. Because after 2 years, Apple would come back to you and say, hey, is this fixed in the latest version of Xcode? Chances are very high you don't actually have a way to reproduce it for multiple reasons, which are the same for open source projects. So maybe the user just went with a different solution. Maybe the user just found a workaround and isn't actually interested in spending more time on this. Or maybe the user even switched company or team, like they don't actually have access to the source code anymore. So having a bot can ensure that all issues on your projects are still relevant and reproducible. So for Fastlane, when an issue has no activity for like 2 months, the Fastlane bot will ask if the issue is still relevant and reproducible with the most recent Fastlane version. And if no one replies to that, the bot will comment again and even close the issue and say, hey, if you still have this problem, please submit a new one. And finally, if no one comments on that, we will even lock the conversation so that no one can comment on it anymore. Which brings you to the next topic on why you should lock old resolved issues. So the problem is that people would comment on old issues with lots of subscribers, triggering email notifications for all the people who are subscribed. Because sometimes people would comment on issues that kind of sound similar, but they're actually not the same. Or sometimes people would comment, me too, but they don't add any value to the discussion. They just, again, trigger email notifications. So by telling users to submit a new GitHub issue, you properly go through the complete lifecycle of a GitHub issue again. First, the user submits an issue on GitHub. Then, the bot verifies that all the relevant information is available. Finally, the actual discussion happens with the support team, basically. And finally, the issue either gets resolved or it gets auto-closed by the bot. So looking at all these bot features I just explained, how much did it actually help for the Fastlane project? Well, by just introducing those things, we reduced the number of open issues and PRs dramatically. We went down from over 700 open tickets to less than 300, and we stayed there for almost the last year. So until now, we mostly covered issues, but a very essential part of open source projects is also pull requests. And for most open source projects, you already have a CI system that verifies that the tests succeed and that code style verifies is valid. So tests, however, don't ensure the way how changes are introduced. So that's why I built Danger together with a friend of mine. So Danger is an open source Ruby tool that allows you to define rules for pull requests. So this is a really cool thing because you can define rules like, hey, if this file gets modified, show a warning that if this was really intentional. Or maybe if there's 20 new lines of code, there must be at least one new test being added to the code base. This is a really cool project. I encourage you all to check it out. And another thing Danger can help with is the PR and runs. So very often, this happens on a lot of open source projects, and you've probably seen it somewhere yourself. People would take the time to fork your project, modify it, and then submit a pull request. And then the tests fail, and nothing happens. The author doesn't go ahead and fix the test, it's just there, and the tests are red. And why is that? Because GitHub doesn't send the author an email if the tests fail. So very often, they are just not aware that this PR is not OK. So you as a maintainer now have to go ahead and tell the author to fix the tests. And this, of course, is something you don't want to spend time on, right? So with Danger, you can actually pass the test results on your CI system and then post a comment on GitHub telling the user how to fix the test. With open source projects, steering that direction is a lot harder than with commercial projects, but when you work remotely and asynchronously, right? Very often this works across time zones. So many bigger open source projects, including Danger and Fastlane, introduced a vision.md document. The vision file describes the bigger picture goals and the overall architecture of your project. And this allows you to reference this when someone submits an issue or a feature request. And the beauty of this approach is that everybody has the opportunity to submit a pull request to this file, and therefore proposing changes in the policy. And as your user base grows, you want more people helping you, joining you, maintaining the project, and pushing it forward. You want to increase the buzz factor as your project grows, meaning more and more people have push access to the repo and are familiar with the project. And with a growing community, you have to make sure that every developer is in a safe environment. The one step you should do very early on in your project is to add a code of conduct. And who here in the audience is on a monorepo? That's not a lot of people, maybe 5. OK, think about it. I work at Google, I'm biased. But so if you don't have a monorepo and have a very complex open source structure, like a lot of repos, lots of dependencies, you should make it easy for contributors to set up the development environment. for a lot of open source projects, you need to actually spend a lot of time setting the project up, and you want to avoid that. And this is something many open source projects don't consider. Keep the code base simple, because the more complex your software architecture is, the less people are able to actually look inside the code and are able to contribute. So instead of using the latest Swift magic to save 4 lines of code, use the easiest to understand approach to solve a specific problem, making it easier for new people to contribute to your project. And of course, be as welcoming and friendly as you can. Like, thank people when they submit issues. Thank people if they submit bug reports. And of course, ask for help or clarification if needed. The last topic for this talk is about saying no to features. Like, you have to say no to a lot of things, but you still want your project to somehow grow, right? So you can actually implement various ways to do that. One thing is you can do is a domain-specific language. So projects like Fastlane, CocoaPods, Bundler all offer a DSL that allows developers to implement a very dynamic configuration. Instead of having static values, like it is the case for JSON or YAML files, you can actually execute code in these files. So this is extremely useful to fetch values on demand, or even access external web services from your configuration file. And this allows developers to have a very flexible configuration. The next step is for people to allow people to extend their project without having to modify the code base. So you could offer some kind of local actions or local plugin system. But once developers want to share the integrations, you have to provide an ecosystem to make it possible for developers to share the integrations. So one way to do that is to use plugins. And while it's not possible for all kinds of projects, if you implement a plugin system, it allows your project to advance at a much faster pace. And you can already use some of the existing dependency managers out there instead of implementing your own thing. So scaling open source projects is really hard, and you will face a lot of challenges as your project grows. But ideally, you're not the only person having to solve all these things, but you have a community you can ask for help for. And without the amazing Fastlane community, Fastlane would never be where it is now. And good open source projects stay alive for a really, really long time, and you can have an enormous impact on developers and companies around the world. So even if it's sometimes a little tough and a little exhausting to work on them, there is nothing more rewarding than seeing how these open source projects are used by your fellow developers. And if you have any ideas on how to make open source projects better for both sides, please come say hi after my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix, for joining us today. I think we've got some time left, and I've seen a couple of questions here. So maybe we can do a little Q&A if you like.
Yeah.
Shall we start? Cool.
Yeah.
So one question is, what is your favorite open source project other than Fastlane?
Interesting. I was recently working for the first time with JavaScript and React, and that was actually a really smooth onboarding experience. I didn't contribute to the project yet, but I would say that's my current favorite.
Cool. Which measure reduced the number of open issues the most?
What is that? Could you repeat that?
Which measure that you took reduced the number of open issues the most?
Which measure removed the number of issues? I would definitely say auto-closing of inactive issues, because it's both us as maintainers and the users just forget to close an issue. Like, that's not done on intent, it just happens. Yeah.
Okay. I got a question about maintainer burnout. This is something that's mostly not really been spoken about.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that and how to avoid that? That would be interesting.
Right, yeah, that's definitely a tough question. So when I currently go to my GitHub page, I open up a list of 2,500 unread notifications. Like, there's no way I can go through all of them. And as soon as you have this relationship with open source where you say, I want to reply to every incoming thing, I want to help every of my users, you will eventually burn out. Like, it's really hard to balance. Like, how do you decide how important this issue is? And the only advice I really have is that you set clear boundaries on like times and time durations you actually work on open source projects. because otherwise it's 24/7, right?
Okay. You can keep asking now if you're interested. You can use the app and ask questions. I got another one. How do you prioritize issues on GitHub? What's the metric, or what's your approach to that?
It's also really tough because most of it comes down to your own kind of like feeling how important an issue is. So one measurement you can always do is like the upvotes on GitHub. Like people can upvote issues nowadays. That's one thing you can do, but that's not always a good measure because sometimes people don't know what they want, right? And so I would basically go through my list and list of issues and decide which ones to open based on the title, which is kind of similar to what people with a lot of emails do, right? They don't read all the emails, but depending on what the subject is, they decide to open it up.
Okay. I got another one is, how did you promote Fastlane at the start of your project?
Could you repeat that?
How did you promote Fastlane at the start of your project?
Right, how did I promote Fastlane? So I started it by just tweeting about it, and back then a low number of followers, so it didn't really work. But then I was talking with with some of the iOS developer influencers, and some of them actually found this project really interesting, so they tweeted about it as well, or retweeted it. And so with every launch of a new feature or launch of a new tool, you would kind of have this effect that it goes up and up and up. And so for iOS, one of the main areas where people came from was the so-called iOS Dev Weekly, which is a very big iOS developer newsletter, which they have a lot of readers.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last one if you like, and then I think we're going to shut it down. Will Fastlane continue to support iOS now that it is owned by Google?
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of people ask me that. So, of course, Android, everybody knows that Google does a lot of Android stuff, right? But on iOS, people are not too sure about. And as it turns out, they are very interested in supporting more iOS. And the reason for that is that we have all this Google Cloud, we have Firebase, which is mobile developer tooling with analytics and crash reporting and so on. And currently, they want to have more iOS developers using those products. So Fastlane, with it being open source, generating no revenue, generating no data, it's still something Google is very excited about because it allows them to have a cool product, just be provided to the community. They don't get anything in return besides having their name behind it, which is a win-win for everybody, I would say.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Felix.
All right, thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, please make some noise for Felix Krause.